The great hall of the Galactic Council buzzed with nervous energy. Representatives from 47 different worlds sat in their assigned seats, their various forms creating a rainbow of colors and shapes. Some had wings, others had tentacles, and a few looked like walking crystals. But all eyes were focused on the center of the room where three figures stood waiting. Admiral Jake Morrison adjusted his dark blue uniform and looked around the massive chamber. The human representative had been to many important meetings, but this one felt different. Today, the council would decide if humans deserved full membership in the galactic community, or if they should be treated as a dangerous species that needed to be watched carefully. Next to him stood Captain Lisa Brooks, her red hair tied back in a tight bun. She carried a tablet full of data about human colonies and trade agreements. Both humans knew the numbers looked good, but numbers might not be enough today. The third figure was the reason they were all here. General Vexstar of the Krillian Empire stood tall on his 6 legs, his purple shell gleaming under the bright lights. His 4 arms gestured wildly as he spoke to other council members, and his voice carried across the room like thunder. "They are too violent," General Vexstar was saying to a group of delegates. "Humans have been in space for less than 50 years, and they have already fought in 12 major conflicts. They expand too fast, fight too hard, and show no respect for established boundaries." A delegate from the peaceful Zephyrian Federation nodded slowly. "The general speaks truth. We have reports of human soldiers doing terrible things during the Centauri Rebellion. They used weapons that other species would never consider." Admiral Morrison felt his jaw tighten, but Captain Brooks put a gentle hand on his arm. "Let them talk," she whispered. "We knew this was coming." The council chamber fell silent as the chief moderator, a wise old being from the Andromedan Republic, called for order. His voice was calm but carried the weight of centuries. "We are here to discuss the application of the human species for full membership in the Galactic Council. General Vexstar has presented evidence that humans may be too aggressive for peaceful coexistence." General Vexstar stepped forward, his multiple eyes gleaming. "Honored council members, I do not speak from hatred or fear. I speak from experience. I have fought against humans, and I have seen what they are capable of. They do not fight like civilized beings. They fight like wild animals, using any means necessary to win." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Several delegates looked nervous, while others seemed convinced by the general's words. "During the Centauri Rebellion," General Vexstar continued, "human soldiers used suicide attacks against our forces. They turned civilian equipment into weapons. They refused to surrender even when facing certain death. This is not the behavior of a species ready for peaceful cooperation." Admiral Morrison started to stand, but another voice cut through the tension. "May I speak?" All eyes turned to a corner of the chamber where a figure had been sitting quietly. Commander Zethkri of the Vorthan Republic stood slowly, his 4 arms folded across his chest. His crystalline scales caught the light as he moved, an old battle. Scars were visible across his face and arms. The chief moderator looked surprised. "Commander Zethkri, you were not scheduled to address the council today." "I understand," Zethkri replied, his voice deep and measured. "But I have heard General Vexstar's words, and I cannot remain silent. I too fought in the Centauri Rebellion. I fought alongside humans for 3 years. I have seen what they are capable of, and I believe this council needs to hear the full truth." General Vexstar's shell darkened with anger. "The Vorthan commander speaks of fighting with humans, not against them. His perspective is clouded by friendship." Zethkri's 4 eyes fixed on the general. "My perspective is clouded by experience. There is a difference between fighting like an animal and fighting like a human. I learned that difference the hard way." The chamber buzzed with conversation as delegates whispered to each other. The chief moderator raised his hand for silence. "Commander Zethkri, if you wish to present testimony, you may do so, but understand that your words will be recorded and considered in our final decision." Zethkri nodded slowly. "I understand, and I accept the responsibility." Captain Brooks looked at Admiral Morrison with surprise. They had not expected support from the Vorthan Republic. The Vorthans were known for their careful, methodical approach to everything. If one of their commanders was willing to speak for humans, it carried significant weight. Honored council members, Zethkri began, walking to the center of the chamber. I came here today planning to remain silent. I thought the humans could speak for themselves. But I have heard words that paint an incomplete picture of what human soldiers truly are. He paused, looking around the chamber at the many different faces watching him. General Vextar speaks of human violence, human aggression, human refusal to surrender. These things are true, but he does not speak of why humans fight or how. They choose their battles or what they are willing to sacrifice for others. The general's purple shell grew darker. Pretty words cannot hide ugly facts, Commander? No, Zethkri agreed. But ugly facts without context can hide beautiful truths. If this council will permit me, I would like to share what I learned about humans during the Centauri Rebellion. Not just what they did, but why they did it. The chief moderator looked. Around the chamber, several delegates nodded their agreement. Even some who had seemed convinced by General Vextar's arguments looked curious. The council will hear your testimony, Commander Zethkri. You may begin. Zethkri took a deep breath, his crystalline scales shifting color slightly. Then I will tell you about the day I learned that humans do not fight like animals. They fight like something far more dangerous and far more worthy of respect. The chamber fell completely silent. Even General Vextar stopped moving, waiting to hear what the Vorthan commander would say. I will tell you about the siege of Colony 7, and about a young human lieutenant who taught me that there are worse things than dying in battle. There are things worth living for, and things worth dying for, and humans seem to understand the difference better than any species I have ever encountered. Admiral Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard stories about Colony 7, but never from an alien perspective. Captain Brooks gripped her tablet tighter, realizing that their fate might depend on the words of this scarred warrior who had fought beside human soldiers. The council chamber waited in perfect silence as Commander Zethkri prepared to share his first tale of human warfare. Commander Zethkri closed his 4 eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, his voice carried the weight of old memories. Colony 7 was a mining settlement on the edge of the Centauri system. 20,000 civilians lived there, mostly families who worked the asteroid fields. It was not a military target, but General Vextar's forces attacked it anyway. General Vextar's shell darkened, but he remained silent. The other council members leaned forward, eager to hear the story. I was sent there as a liaison officer. Zethkri continued. My job was to observe human military tactics and report back to the Vorthan High Command. We had just formed an alliance with Earth, and my people wanted to understand how humans fought. The commander's crystalline scales shifted color as he remembered. I expected to see crude tactics and reckless behavior. The humans had been in space for such a short time. How could they possibly understand real warfare? He paused, looking directly at General Vextar. The siege began at dawn. 3 full Krillian battle groups surrounded the colony. The humans had only 200 Marines and a handful of outdated ships. Any reasonable commander would have surrendered immediately. Captain Brooks found herself holding her breath. She had read the reports about Colony 7, but hearing it from someone who was actually there made it feel more real. The human commander was Lieutenant Ben Carter, Zethkri said, his voice growing warmer. He was 26 years old, barely more than a child by my people's standards. When I met him, he was sitting in the colony's communications center, trying to coordinate an evacuation while enemy ships bombarded the outer settlements. The Vorthan commander walked slowly around the center of the chamber as he spoke. I told Lieutenant Carter that resistance was pointless. The Krillians had 50 times more firepower and would kill every civilian if the humans did not surrender. Do you know what he said to me? Several council members shook their heads. He said, Commander, with respect, I didn't ask for your opinion. I asked if you wanted to help save lives. Zethkri's 4 eyes sparkled with something that might have been amusement. No one had ever spoken to me like that before. I was older, more experienced, and from a species that had been fighting wars for thousands of years. But this young human treated me like an equal. General Vextar shifted uncomfortably. Pretty words do not change the fact that humans are violent. You are correct, Zethkri agreed. But let me tell you about their violence, and you can judge for yourself what kind of species they are. The chamber fell silent again. The evacuation ships could only take half the colonists, Zethkri continued. There was not enough time for multiple trips. Someone had to stay behind and hold off the Krillian ground forces long enough for the ships to escape. Lieutenant Carter asked for volunteers. He stopped walking and looked around the chamber. Every single Marine volunteered. Not just the officers, not just the veterans, everyone, even the youngest private, a boy named Danny Walsh who could not have been more than 19 years old. The commander's voice grew quieter, but Carter did not choose everyone. He chose 12 Marines to stay with him. The rest would go with the evacuation ships to protect the civilians during the journey. Do you understand what this means? The humans were not trying to die gloriously. They were trying to save as many lives as possible. Admiral Morrison felt a lump in his throat. He had known Ben Carter personally. The young lieutenant had been one of the finest officers he had ever served with. I decided to stay, Zethkri said simply. I told myself it was to observe their tactics, but the truth was different. I stayed because I could not bear the thought of leaving them to die alone. The Vorthan commander's scales shifted to a darker color. The evacuation ships launched just as the first Krillian dropships landed. We had maybe 4 hours before the main assault began. Carter gathered us in the colony's main hall and explained. His plan, he looked at General Vextar again. There was no plan. We had 13 soldiers, some mining equipment, and a handful of defensive positions. The Krillians had 3,000 troops, heavy weapons, and air support. By any reasonable measure, we should have been dead within the first hour. So what happened? Asked a delegate from the Zephyrian Federation. Something I had never seen before, Zethkri replied. The humans did not fight like soldiers. They fought like engineers. Sergeant Amy Rodriguez, the unit's medic, turned the colony's medical bay into a fortress. She used surgical lasers as weapons and medical scanners to detect enemy movement. Through walls, the commander's voice grew more animated. Private Danny Walsh, the boy I mentioned, was supposed to be a demolitions expert, but there were no proper explosives available. So he turned mining charges into smart bombs. He used the colony's industrial fabricators to create weapons that should not have existed. Several council members looked impressed despite themselves. Lieutenant Carter coordinated everything from the communications center, Zethkri continued. He used the colony's civilian networks to create a battle management system. He turned garbage collectors into armored vehicles and construction robots into automated gun turrets. In 4 hours, they transformed a peaceful mining colony into a death trap. General Vextar's multiple eyes narrowed. You make it sound like they won the battle. They did, Zethkri said quietly. Not the way you might think, but they won. When the Krillian assault began, they expected to face desperate humans hiding in bunkers. Instead, they walked into a carefully planned ambush. The chamber was completely silent now. Even the usual background hum of the building systems seemed to have stopped. The humans did not just fight, Zethkri explained. They adapted. Every time the Krillians tried a new tactic, the humans found a counter. When the enemy used flying units, Danny Walsh shot them down with mining lasers. When they tried to outflank us, Sergeant Rodriguez had already prepared medical nanobots that attacked their equipment. He paused for a moment, his scales flickering. But the most remarkable thing was not their tactics or their weapons. It was their attitude. They were not afraid to die, but they were terrified of failing. Every decision they made was about protecting people they had never met. Admiral Morrison wiped his eyes quietly. He remembered receiving the reports from Colony 7, but hearing it described this way made him proud to be human. The battle lasted 18 hours, Zethkri concluded. When it ended, 12 of the 13 humans were wounded, and I had learned something important. Humans do not fight because they enjoy violence. They fight because they cannot bear to let others suffer when they have the power to help. General Vextar was quiet for a long moment. Finally he spoke. One battle does not define a species. Commander, no, Zethkri agreed. But it can reveal their character, and that was only the beginning of what I learned about humans during the war. Commander Zethkri looked around the chamber, noting how the delegates had shifted in their seats. Some who had seemed convinced by General Vextar's arguments now looked thoughtful. Others appeared confused, as if trying to understand something that did not fit their expectations. The Battle of Titan's Edge happened 6 months later, Zethkri continued, his voice steady and clear. By then, I had been assigned permanently to human forces. My superiors wanted more detailed reports about their fighting methods. He gestured toward Admiral Morrison. The humans had established a research station near the edge of the system. It was studying something called quantum field manipulation. I never understood the science, but I knew it was important. General Vextar's shell clicked impatiently. More human violence, Commander? Patience, General, Zethkri replied. This story is about something different. It is about what humans do when they face impossible odds. The Vorthan commander's scales shifted to a deeper blue color. The research station housed 300 scientists and their families. Children. Live there, General. When your fleet arrived with 50 warships, the humans could have evacuated everyone. They had 12 hours before you entered weapons range. Several council members looked at General Vextar, who remained silent. But the humans discovered something during those 12 hours, Zethkri continued. Your fleet was not just passing through. You were planning to use the research station as a base to attack civilian shipping lanes. Thousands of innocent people would die if you took control of that location. The commander walked closer to the center of the chamber. The human commander was a pilot named Rick Hayes. He had been flying military spacecraft for 15 years. When I met him, he was sitting in the station's docking bay, staring at his fighter craft like it held the answers to all his problems. Admiral Morrison remembered Commander Hayes well. He had been one of the finest pilots in the fleet, known for his calm thinking under pressure. I asked Commander Hayes why he did not evacuate the station, Zethkri said. He looked at me with those strange human eyes and said, because if we run, they win. And if they win here, a lot of good people die later. The chamber was quiet except for the soft hum of the air recycling systems. The humans had exactly 17 fighter craft, Zethkri continued. Your fleet had 50 capital ships and 200 fighters. The math was simple. The humans would be destroyed in minutes. General Vextar finally spoke. Then why did they not surrender? Because they were not trying to win a battle, Zethkri replied. They were trying to solve a problem. And humans are very good at solving problems. The Vorthan commander's scales flickered with remembered amusement. Major Kate Sullivan was the station's operations officer. She was a small woman with short, brown hair and the most dangerous mind I have ever encountered. While Commander Hayes prepared his fighters, Major Sullivan was turning the research station into something that should not have been possible. Captain Brooks found herself leaning forward. She had heard rumors about Titan's Edge, but no one had ever explained exactly what happened there. The research station was studying quantum fields, Zethkri explained. Major Sullivan realized that the equipment could be modified to create a localized gravity well. Not big enough to destroy a fleet, but big enough to disrupt their formation and slow their approach. He paused, looking around the chamber. But the equipment was not designed for military use. It needed to be rebuilt completely, and there were only 8 hours left before your fleet arrived. Impossible, muttered a delegate from the Andromedan Republic. Quantum field generators require months of careful calibration. That is what I told Major Sullivan, Zethkri agreed. She smiled at me and said, Commander, impossible is just another word for something we haven't figured out yet. The Vorthan commander's 4 eyes sparkled. The humans worked like machines. No, that is wrong. Machines work according to their programming. The humans worked like they were fighting for their lives, which they were. Captain Tony Martinez was the station's chief engineer, Zethkri continued. He was a big man with thick arms and a voice that could be heard across the entire station. He took apart 3 quantum field generators and rebuilt them into one massive device in 6 hours. General Vextar's shell darkened. You are describing the weapon that destroyed half my fleet. I am describing desperate people doing impossible things, Zethkri corrected. Captain Martinez did not build a weapon, he built a tool. What happened next was not planned by anyone. The chamber fell. Silent again. When your fleet arrived, Commander Hayes led his 17 fighters in a direct assault, Zethkri said. It looked like suicide. Your ships opened fire immediately, and 3 human fighters were destroyed in the first minute. The commander's voice grew quieter. But the fighters were not trying to win a battle. They were trying to herd your fleet into a specific position. Every move they made was calculated to force your ships closer together. Admiral Morrison felt his chest tighten. He had recommended Rick Hayes for promotion just before the battle. The pilot had never lived to receive it. Major Sullivan waited until your fleet was in the perfect position, Zethkri continued. Then she activated the quantum field generator. The gravity well appeared directly in the center of your formation. General, Vextar's multiple eyes closed. 27 ships were pulled into the gravity well. The crews of those ships died instantly. Yes, Zethkri said softly. But Major Sullivan did not create the gravity well to kill your people. She created it to stop your attack. The deaths were an accident that haunted her for the rest of her life. The Vorthan commander looked directly at General Vextar. I was monitoring human communications during the battle. When Major Sullivan realized how many of your people had died, she broke down crying. Commander Hayes had to take over the tactical coordination while she recovered. Several council members looked surprised. The humans won the battle, Zethkri continued. Your remaining ships retreated and the research station was saved. But the humans did not celebrate. They spent the next 3 days trying to rescue survivors from the ships caught in the gravity well. He paused, letting that sink in. They risked their own lives to save the people who had been trying to kill them just hours before. General. Vextar was quiet for a long moment. My nephew was on one of those ships, he said finally. Human rescue teams pulled him from the wreckage. He spent 2 weeks in their medical bay. The humans did not have to save him, Zethkri pointed out. They could have left him to die. But they chose to help, even though he was their enemy. The chamber buzzed with quiet conversation as delegates whispered to each other. The story of Titan's Edge was clearly having an impact. This is what I learned about humans at Titan's Edge, Zethkri concluded. They do not fight because they enjoy destroying their enemies. They fight because they cannot bear to let evil succeed. And when the fighting is over, they try to heal the damage, even when that damage was necessary to save innocent lives. Captain Brooks wiped her eyes quietly. She had never heard the full story of Titan's Edge before, and it made her proud to be human. General Vextar looked around the chamber, his expression thoughtful. One more story, Commander. But this one proves nothing about human nature. Desperate. People do desperate things, perhaps, Zethkri agreed. But I have more stories to tell. And each one taught me something new about what it means to be human. Commander Zethkri stood quietly for a moment, his crystalline scales shifting to a darker shade. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. The next story I will tell you is different, he said, looking around the chamber. It is not about battles or victories. It is about what happens to human warriors when the fighting stops. General Vextar's shell clicked softly. More human weakness, Commander? You will have to decide for yourself, Zethkri replied. But I learned something important about strength and weakness during the aftermath of the Proxima offensive. The Vorthan commander walked slowly to the center of the chamber. The Proxima offensive was meant to be the final battle of the Centauri. Rebellion. Human forces had pushed the Krillian army back to their last stronghold on Proxima Beta. Victory was certain. He paused, his 4 eyes focusing on something only he could see. I was attached to the 3rd Marine Division, commanded by Colonel Steve Parker. He was a career soldier, 43 years old, with 20 years of military service. I had never seen a more professional warrior. Admiral Morrison shifted uncomfortably. He had served with Steve Parker early in his career and knew what was coming. Colonel Parker was everything a military commander should be, Zethkri continued. He was calm under pressure, decisive in battle, and completely dedicated to his soldiers. His men would have followed him anywhere. The commander's scales flickered. The battle for Proxima Beta lasted 3 days. The Krillian forces were well prepared and desperate. They had nowhere left to retreat, so they fought harder than ever before. Several council members leaned forward, sensing that this story would be different from the others. On the second day of the battle, the Krillians made a terrible decision, Zethkri said, his voice growing quieter. They began using civilian prisoners as human shields. Families who had been captured during earlier battles were forced to stand in front of Krillian positions. The chamber fell silent. Even General Vextar Eschel stopped clicking. Colonel Parker faced an impossible choice, Zethkri continued. He could order his troops to fire through the civilians to reach the Krillian positions, or he could watch. His own soldiers died trying to find another way. The Vorthan commander's scales darkened further. I watched Colonel Parker make that decision. He stood in his command post, looking at the tactical displays, and I could see him calculating the cost of every possible choice. "What did he do?" asked a delegate from the Zephyrian Federation. "He ordered his troops to find another way," Zethkri replied. Even though it meant more human soldiers would die, he refused to sacrifice innocent civilians. The attack was delayed by 6 hours while the humans found a way to separate the prisoners from their captors. Admiral Morrison felt a knot form in his stomach. He remembered the reports from Proxima Beta, but hearing it from an alien perspective made it more real. The delay worked, Zethkri continued. The humans rescued most of the civilian prisoners and defeated the Krillian forces. Colonel Parker's decision saved hundreds of innocent lives. General Vextar's multiple eyes narrowed. "Then why do you say this story is about weakness?" "Because of what happened after the battle," Zethkri replied. "I found Colonel Parker sitting alone in his tent 3 hours after the victory was announced. This man who had commanded thousands of soldiers with perfect confidence was crying like a child." The chamber buzzed with quiet conversation. Several delegates looked confused. "I asked Colonel Parker why he was upset," Zethkri said. "His forces had won a great victory. The rebellion was over. His soldiers respected him. What could possibly be wrong?" The Vorthan commander's voice grew softer. Colonel Parker looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, "We didn't save them all. 43 civilians died because I wasn't smart enough to find a better way." Captain Brooks felt her throat tighten. She had read the casualty reports from Proxima Beta 43. Civilian deaths out of nearly 2,000 prisoners was an incredible success. But she was beginning to understand why it had not felt like success to Colonel Parker. "I told Colonel Parker that saving most of the prisoners was a great achievement," Zethkri continued. "Any other commander would have been proud of such a result. Do you know what he said to me?" Several council members shook their heads. He said, "Commander, each of those 43 people had families. They had children who will never see their parents again. How can I celebrate when I failed to save them all?" The chamber was completely silent now. Even the soft hum of the air recycling system seemed to have stopped. "That was when I met Dr. Helen Wright," Zethkri said, his scales shifting to a lighter color. "She was a military psychologist assigned to help human soldiers deal with the stress of combat. She had been treating Colonel Parker and many other human warriors." The commander looked around the chamber. Dr. Wright explained something to me that I had never understood before. She said that humans carry the weight of every decision they make in battle. Every life they save and every life they fail to save becomes part of who they are. General Vextar Eschel clicked softly. "That sounds like a weakness that could be exploited." "That is what I thought at first," Zethkri agreed. "But Dr. Wright showed me something else. She introduced me to Corporal Alex Johnson, a young soldier who had been present during the civilian rescue operation. The Vorthan commander's voice grew gentler. Corporal Johnson was 22 years old, barely more than a child. He had been the one who found the bodies of the civilians who did not survive the rescue attempt. The experience had broken something. Inside him, Admiral Morrison closed his eyes. He had met soldiers like Alex Johnson before, young warriors who had seen too much too soon. Dr. Wright was helping Corporal Johnson understand that he was not responsible for the deaths of those civilians. Zethkri continued, but the young soldier could not accept that. He kept saying that he should have been faster, should have been smarter, should have found a way to save everyone. The commander paused, looking directly at General Vextar. I asked Dr. Wright if this emotional burden made human soldiers less effective. She said something that changed my understanding of human nature completely. What did she say? Asked the delegate from the Zephyrian Federation. She said that the emotional burden does not make human soldiers weaker. It makes them stronger. Because they care so much about protecting innocent people, they fight harder and think more carefully than soldiers who do not feel that responsibility. Zethkri's scales shifted to a brighter color. Dr. Wright showed me medical records from other species who had fought in similar conflicts. Soldiers from races that do not form emotional attachments to their missions showed higher rates of what she called moral injury when they were forced to make difficult decisions. The chamber buzzed with quiet conversation as delegates discussed this information. But humans who felt responsible for the people they protected actually recovered faster from combat stress, Zethkri continued. Their emotional connection too. Their mission gave them a sense of purpose that helped them heal. General Vextar was quiet for a long moment. You're saying that human weakness is actually strength? I am saying that what looks like weakness might be the source of their greatest strength, Zethkri replied. Colonel Parker's tears did not make him a worse commander. They made him a better one because he cared enough to learn from his mistakes. The Vorthan commander looked around the chamber one more time. I spent 3 months on Proxima Beta after the battle ended. I watched human soldiers help rebuild the settlements that had been damaged during the fighting. I saw them working alongside former enemies to create something better than what had existed before. And what did you learn from that? Asked the chief moderator. I learned that humans do not fight because they enjoy destruction, Zethkri said. They fight because they cannot bear to see others suffer. And when the fighting is over, they carry the weight of every decision they made because they understand that every life has value. The chamber fell silent as the delegates absorbed this information. The story of Proxima Beta was clearly having a profound impact on their understanding of human nature. Commander Zethkri's scales shifted to their darkest color yet as he prepared to speak. The chamber had grown more silent with each story, and now the tension was thick enough to touch. The final story I will share with you is the hardest one to tell, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It is about the siege of New Geneva, and it is about what humans do when they face certain death with no hope of escape. General Vextar's shell had stopped clicking entirely. Even he seemed to sense that this story would be different from all the others. New Geneva was a civilian colony with 80,000 people, Zethkri continued. Families, children, elderly citizens, and workers who had never seen combat. It was not a military target, but the Krillian Empire decided to make an example of it. The Vorthan commander walked slowly around the center of the chamber. By then, I was no longer just an observer. I had been given the rank of tactical advisor to the human command structure. I was part of their team. Admiral Morrison felt his chest tighten. He remembered New Geneva well. It had been one of the darkest moments of the entire war. The attack began without warning, Zethkri said. 50 Krillian warships appeared in the system and immediately began bombing civilian targets. There were no military bases on New Geneva, no weapons factories, no strategic resources. The Empire was attacking innocent people to terrify other colonies into surrender. Several council members looked uncomfortable. Even those who had supported General Vextar's position earlier seemed disturbed by this description. General Paul Anderson was the overall commander of human forces in the sector, Zethkri continued. He was 56 years old, a career soldier who had spent his entire adult life protecting others. When the attack began, he had exactly 3,000 Marines and 12 outdated warships to defend 80,000 civilians. The commander's 4 eyes focused on General Vextar. General Anderson sent a message to the Krillian fleet commander. He offered to surrender all human military forces in exchange for safe passage for the civilians. And what was the response? Asked the chief moderator, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The Krillian commander replied that all humans would die, Zethkri said quietly, military and civilian alike. No exceptions. The chamber fell silent except for the sound of breathing from 47 different species. That was when I learned what humans are truly capable of, Zethkri continued. General Anderson called a meeting of all his senior officers. I expected him to discuss evacuation plans or perhaps negotiate a better surrender. Instead, he said something I will never forget. The Vorthan commander's scales flickered. He looked around the room at his officers and said, "We cannot save everyone, but we can make sure the galaxy remembers what happened here. And we can make the enemy pay such a high price that they think twice before doing this again." Captain Brooks felt tears forming in her eyes. She had read the transcripts from that meeting, but hearing it described by someone who was actually there made it more powerful. The evacuation ships could carry maybe 10,000 people, Zethkri said. General Anderson ordered the evacuation of all children under 12 and their mothers. Everyone else would stay and fight. He paused, looking around the chamber. Do you understand what this means? 70,000 people chose to stay and fight a battle they could not win, just to give 10,000 children a chance to escape. General Vextar's multiple eyes closed. That is not tactics. That is madness. Perhaps, Zethkri agreed, but it was also something else. It was a choice that no other species I know would have made. The Vorthan commander's voice grew stronger. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos was in charge of special operations. She was a small woman with dark hair and the coldest eyes I had ever seen. When General Anderson explained the situation, she volunteered to take her team behind enemy lines. What could special forces accomplish against 50 warships? Asked a delegate from the Andromedan Republic. They could not destroy the fleet, Zethkri replied, but they could make the Krillians afraid to land ground troops. Lieutenant Colonel Santos and her team spent the next 18 days making life hell for every Krillian soldier who set foot on New Geneva. The commander's scales brightened slightly. They used every dirty trick in the book: booby traps, ambush, psychological warfare, and improvised weapons. Santos turned the entire colony into a maze of death for the invasion forces. Admiral Morrison remembered Maria Santos well. She had been recommended for the highest military honors, though she had not lived to receive them. But the real hero of New Geneva was Sergeant First Class Ryan Mitchell, Zethkri continued. He was 38 years old, a veteran of 12 major battles. When the main Krillian assault began, his unit was assigned to hold the central plaza. The Vorthan commander's voice grew quieter. The central plaza was the key to the entire defense. If the Krillians took it, they could split the human forces in half and defeat them in detail. Sergeant Mitchell had 42 Marines to hold, a position that should have required at least 500 soldiers. How long did they hold it? Asked the delegate from the Zephyrian Federation. 6 hours, Zethkri replied. But that was not the remarkable part. The remarkable part was what happened after Sergeant Mitchell's unit was reduced to just 3 soldiers. The chamber was completely silent now. I was monitoring communications from the command center, Zethkri said. Sergeant Mitchell reported that his position was overrun and requested permission to withdraw. General Anderson told him to fall back to secondary positions. The commander's scales shifted color again, but Sergeant Mitchell did not withdraw. He sent his last 2 soldiers to safety and stayed at the plaza alone. For the next 6 hours, 1 human soldier held off an entire Krillian battalion. Several council members gasped. How is that possible? Asked General Vextar. Because Sergeant Mitchell was not trying to win, Zethkri explained. He was trying to buy time for the evacuation ships to escape. Every minute he held that position was another minute for the children to get further away from the battle. The Vorthan commander's voice grew softer. I listened to Sergeant Mitchell's radio reports during those 6 hours. He never complained, never asked for help, never expressed fear. He just kept reporting enemy positions and casualty estimates like it was a normal training exercise. Admiral Morrison wiped his eyes openly now. He had recommended Ryan Mitchell for the Medal of Honor personally. But the most incredible thing happened near the end, Zethkri continued. General Anderson was in the command center, coordinating the final stages of the defense. He had been exposed to poison gas during an enemy attack and was slowly dying. The chamber was so quiet that the sound of ventilation systems seemed loud. The medical staff wanted to treat General Anderson immediately, Zethkri said. But he refused treatment so that medical supplies could be used on younger soldiers with better chances of survival. He spent his last 4 hours commanding the defense while his own body shut down. General Vextar's shell had turned completely dark. And what was the result of all this sacrifice? The evacuation ships escaped, Zethkri replied simply. 10,000 children and their mothers reached safety. The Krillian Empire captured New Geneva, but the cost was so high that they never attempted another genocidal attack on civilian targets. The Vorthan commander looked around the chamber one last time. 70,000 humans died at New Geneva, but their sacrifice saved millions of lives in the long run. Because the galaxy learned that genocide comes with a price too high to pay, he paused, his scales shifting to a lighter color. That is what I learned about humans during the Centauri Rebellion. They are not violent because they enjoy destruction. They are willing to be violent because they cannot bear to let evil triumph. And when necessary, they will pay any price to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The chamber remained silent for a long moment as delegates absorbed the full weight of the story. Finally, General Vextar spoke. Commander Zethkri, you have given us much to consider. But now I must ask you directly, do you believe humans should be granted full membership in this council? Zethkri's 4 eyes focused on the general. I believe this galaxy is safer because humans are in it. And I believe we would be fools not to learn from their example. The Great Hall of the Galactic Council remained silent for several minutes after Commander Zethkri finished his final story. Delegates from 47 worlds sat quietly, each processing what they had heard in their own way. Some stared at the floor, others looked at Admiral Morrison with new understanding, and a few wiped tears from eyes that could cry. General Vextar was the first to speak, his voice much quieter than it had been at the beginning of the session. Commander Zethkri, you have painted a very different picture of human warriors than the one I presented to this council. Zethkri's crystalline scales shifted to a neutral color. General, you spoke of human violence and aggression. These things are true, but you spoke of them without context, without understanding why humans fight. The Vorthan commander walked slowly back to the center of the chamber. I have fought alongside humans for 3 years. I have seen them at their best and at their worst. And I have learned that they are not dangerous because they are savage. They are dangerous because they care. A delegate from the peaceful Zephyrian Federation raised her hand. Commander, you have told us stories of human sacrifice and courage. But how can we be sure that these same qualities will not make them a threat to peaceful species? Zethkri turned to face the delegate. Because I have also seen how humans behave when they are not at war. After the Centauri Rebellion ended, I spent 6 months helping to rebuild the damaged colonies. The same soldiers who had fought so fiercely became teachers, engineers, and medical workers. Admiral Morrison shifted in his seat, remembering the reconstruction efforts that had followed the war. The humans did not celebrate their victories, Zethkri continued. They mourned their dead and immediately began working to heal the damage that war had caused. They built schools for enemy children, hospitals for wounded soldiers from all sides, and homes for refugees regardless of their species. The commander's 4 eyes sparkled. Lieutenant Ben Carter, the young officer from Colony 7, became a teacher. He spent 2 years helping Krillian children learn to read. Sergeant Amy Rodriguez opened a medical clinic that treated anyone who needed help, including former enemies. General Vextar S. Shell clicked softly. And what of their military forces? Surely they maintained their weapons and prepared for future wars. They did, Zethkri agreed. But they also did something else. They shared their defensive technologies with other species. They helped peaceful worlds build better protection systems and trained other militaries in defensive tactics. The Vorthan commander looked directly at General Vextar. Your own nephew, the one who was rescued at Titan's Edge, attended a human military academy. He learned tactics and strategy from the same people who had once been his enemies. Several council members looked surprised at this revelation. Captain Brooks found herself thinking about the military exchange programs that had developed after the war. Dozens of species had sent officers to train with human forces, and human advisors had helped establish defense networks throughout the galaxy. But there is something else you must understand, Zethkri said, his voice growing more serious. Humans do not just fight for themselves or their own species. They fight for anyone who cannot fight for themselves. He gestured toward the assembled delegates. During the past 3 years, human forces have intervened in 17 conflicts throughout the galaxy, not to conquer territory or gain resources, but to protect civilian populations from aggression. The chief moderator leaned forward. Can you give us specific examples, Commander? The Betelgeuse Crisis, Zethkri replied immediately. When the Drakmari Empire attempted to enslave the peaceful Altarian colonies, it was human forces that responded to their call for help. The humans had no strategic interest in that sector, no trade agreements with the Altarians, no political alliances to honor. The commander's scales brightened. But when they received a distress signal from a species they had never met, asking for help against an enemy they had never fought, the humans sent 3 battle groups without hesitation. General Vextar was quiet for a moment. I remember that conflict. The Drakmari forces withdrew after just 2 weeks, because the humans made it clear that they would not tolerate the enslavement of innocent people, Zethkri explained. They did not destroy the Drakmari forces. They simply made it too expensive for them to continue their aggression. A delegate from the Andromedan Republic spoke up. Commander, you have convinced many of us that humans can be noble warriors. But what about their rapid expansion? Their colonies spread across space faster than any species in recorded history. Zethkri's scales flickered with what might have been amusement. Yes, humans expand quickly, but have you asked why? I have visited dozens of human colonies, and I can tell you the reason. He paused, looking around the chamber. Humans do not colonize space to build empires or gather resources. They colonize space because they are curious. Every new world is a puzzle to solve, a mystery to explore, a chance to learn something they did not know before. Admiral Morrison smiled slightly. It was true that human colonization efforts were driven more by scientific curiosity than territorial ambition. And when humans find something interesting, Zethkri continued, they want to share it with everyone. Human colonies have some of the most diverse populations in the galaxy. They welcome immigrants from any species that wants to live peacefully. The Vorthan commander walked closer to General Vextar. General, you spoke of human aggression as if it were a fault. But I have learned that human aggression is always directed at those who threaten the innocent. They are not aggressive toward peaceful neighbors. General Vextar's multiple eyes focused on the floor. Commander Zethkri, your words have given me much to think about. Perhaps I have judged humans too harshly based on limited experience. We all judge based on our experience, Zethkri replied gently. But experience can be incomplete. I was fortunate to see humans in many different situations, both in war and in peace. The chief moderator stood slowly, his ancient voice carrying the weight of authority. Commander Zethkri, thank you for your testimony. The Council will now deliberate on the human application for membership. But before the Chief Moderator could continue, General Vextar stood up. Honored Chief Moderator, I request permission to change my position on this matter. The chamber buzzed with surprised conversation. General Vexstar had been the strongest voice against human membership. The floor recognizes General Vexstar, the chief moderator said. The Krillian general's shell had lightened to its natural purple color. Honored council members, I came here today convinced that humans were too dangerous for peaceful coexistence. Commander Zethkri's testimony has shown me that I was wrong. He looked at Admiral Morrison. Humans are dangerous, but they are dangerous to the right people. They are a threat to those who would harm the innocent, enslave the weak, or destroy what others have built. General Vexstar's voice grew stronger. I now believe that the galaxy needs more species like humanity, not fewer. I formally withdraw my objection to human membership and recommend that they be granted full status immediately. The chamber erupted in conversation as delegates discussed this unexpected development. The chief moderator called for order. The council will now vote on the human application. All in favor of granting full membership to the human species? One by one, delegates raised their hands, tentacles, or other appendages to signal their approval. When the count was finished, the result was unanimous. The motion passes, the chief moderator announced. Humanity is hereby granted full membership in the Galactic Council with all rights and responsibilities thereof. Admiral Morrison felt tears in his eyes as he stood to address the council. On behalf of all humanity, I thank you for this honor. We will do our best to prove worthy of your trust. As the formal session ended, General Vexstar approached Admiral Morrison. Admiral, I have a request. My military forces could benefit from human tactical training. Would you be willing to assign advisors to help us improve our defensive capabilities? Morrison smiled and extended his hand. General, it would be our honor to help. Commander Zethkri watched the exchange with satisfaction. His crystalline scales had shifted to their brightest color, reflecting the lights of the chamber like tiny stars. Captain Brooks approached the Vorthan commander. Commander Zethkri, thank you for speaking on our behalf. We will not forget what you did for us today. Zethkri's 4 eyes sparkled. Captain Brooks, I did not speak for you today. I spoke for the galaxy. Because a galaxy with humans in it is a safer place for everyone who values peace and justice. As delegates began to file out of the chamber, discussing the implications of the historic vote, Admiral Morrison reflected on how much had changed in just a few hours. Humanity had entered the day as supplicants seeking acceptance. They were leaving as full members of the galactic community, with new allies and new responsibilities, but perhaps most importantly, they had earned the respect of beings who had once feared them, and that respect had been earned not through demonstrations of power, but through stories of sacrifice, courage, and compassion. The galaxy would never be quite the same.